Today we're going to talk a little bit just about nonverbal communication as a theory. So there are a lot of reasons that we engage in nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication serves a ton of different functions. Uh, Probably, the easiest place to start is to discuss maybe the definition of nonverbal communication, and we see all sorts of different things here. I guess maybe let's go ahead and talk about the purpose, and then we'll get into the definition here in the next slide. The purpose of nonverbal communication is essentially to communicate emotion. And there's a lot of studies, and they differ on the percentage that they arrive at. Some of them say as much as 95%. The Morabian in 69 study says that as much as 95% of the emotional content of a message is conveyed through nonverbal channels. So you can say the same thing and say it with three different nonverbal, sort of interpretations, and it means three, completely different things. But that's based on paralanguage. That's like vocalics. That's the quality, of the stresses that you put on the different syllables or on the different words. And that's also facial expressions. You're saying all of that, but you're making a nonverbal gesture that undercuts your conclusion, or that isn't, it doesn't have a whole lot of fidelity with the rest of your message. So here in the middle, I think that's a good one. This guy's not really excited about whatever it is, but he's putting on a smile, literally. This person engages in surprise, and she thinks that it's impolite for her to sit there with her mouth open, so she covers her mouth. This person legitimately does look like they're making a wish. They've literally got their fingers crossed, and they kind of took a second and had a little reverie, and decided to put that out there in the world and try to manifest something. And then you have various different other surprise, aggravation, beseeching, just I beg you, obviously, angry, all sorts of expressions here conveyed. So hopefully from that you get that a huge part of the emotional component, and indeed a big part of the relational component of our communication, comes through those nonverbal channels. So be aware of that. How people say things, what they are saying, how their nonverbal communication augments or repeats or emphasizes their verbal communication. Is there congruence between what this person is saying and what they're doing? And that's a big one because, people can say whatever they want to. Very few people effectively regulate their nonverbal communication to such an extent that their lies are believable. Most people have nonverbal slippage, and they tell you much of what they are feeling, if not what they are thinking, through their nonverbal communication. So pay attention to that. What do some of these things mean? Also understand that there is no, and I'm so thankful, I'm so grateful that we looked at language, last week. Because we now have a common set of vocabulary words to describe a few things. We have no way of determining what the cause of emotions are. We have some fairly accurate indicators, based on what other folks have done with facial expressions in the past, that this person is either feeling that emotion, or that this person is wanting us to think that they're feeling that emotion. But we have some emotional indicators. What we do not have really is a denotative definition of nonverbal communication. Very few denotative definitions of nonverbal communication. That's why the micro expressions and the advances that we've made in nonverbal communication are so important. So, little definition. The definition of nonverbal communication: all communication received through channels other than verbal. Non-communication can include both vocalic and non-vocalic communication. So how I say something is paralanguage. That is nonverbal communication. Depending on which word you emphasize in a sentence, the sentence can mean completely different things. So we'll look at a couple of examples of that when the time comes. Nonverbal communication includes communication that's gathered through visual, auditory, sensory, olfactory, and gastronomic inputs. All 5 of your senses. You got taste, smell, touch, hearing, and seeing. Pretty much all 5 of those all involve nonverbal communication. So then briefly, just to kind of preview, where we're going to go ultimately in the lesson. We're going to talk about, we'll conclude a lot of this lesson with some discussion of some very specific types of nonverbal communication. Kinesics, haptics, physical appearance, artifacts, proxemics, chronemics, paralanguage, silence, and environmental factors. All of these things are 9 different elements, essentially, of nonverbal communication. And skilled interpersonal communicators can use each of these to communicate different messages and can understand when they are being communicated with one of these methods. So I ran across this slide when I was getting ready for our lecture, and I just thought that it was a completely wonderful slide. And I would caption that if I had some more time to put a call out in it. I would caption that. Everyone really loved my lecture about nonverbal communication. This is one of the things that kind of prompted me to get interested in feedback and get interested in how people communicate with other people who are trying to communicate with them. So if you're up there and you're a public speaker, man, this is what you don't want to see. You've got a whole bunch of people. You've got somebody stretching. You got somebody playing with their hair. You got somebody counting the ceiling tiles, if not actively asleep. You got somebody, kind of just, wow, let me rub the inside of my jaw here, to try to stay awake. You've got head in hands. You've got head on the actual table, and this guy just keeps wonking on, I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with what we do in the shadows, but there's an energy vampire on there that I think is just hilarious. His name's Colin Robinson. Anyway, it reminds me of something he would do at a city council meeting, just try to be purposely boring and put everybody to sleep, so you can suck all their energy. Anyway, this audience is communicating with this man. They are telling him something, but he's not listening to it. He's not getting it. So when somebody honors you with their attention, be interesting at least. So we have a number of different studies. Morabian did a study. There were some other studies. I think Hardy is another study, like in 2011, that's mentioned in your textbook. And I mentioned to you that Morabian found that as much as 95% of the emotional meaning of a message is here in nonverbal communication. As much as 65% of that relational / emotional content is through the nonverbal channel. So there's some differences. Some folks have found, like I said, up to 95%. Some other folks have found a little bit different measurement that it's at 65%. either one of those figures, it is an overwhelming amount of relational information and emotional information that's being brought to you through that nonverbal channel. So really pay attention to it. Um, you're also getting, kind of a little bit different context now that we've introduced cell phones into that situation. If folks can, sort of look there, at their phone, you're getting even fewer, kind of relational, sort of bits of information conveyed through that sort of a format. In addition to fewer, sort of relational things, you're kind of, if someone's communicating in mass, you may be getting, communication that's meant for everybody, but you think that it's meant for you, and that may be something that's lost in translation as far as that percentage goes. So I don't know if social media changes that context. I would assume that it does. Cell phones being added into that, I would assume that it does. So perhaps one of you will become a communication researcher and will dive into that and conduct some of that research that assumes some of those more modern contexts. Again, you get all kinds of information. Pay attention to it. It is very obvious if you just look for it. So let's begin some more of the theoretical kind of discussion of nonverbal communication by pointing out some of the similarities between that and verbal communication. So we talked about hot dog, and we brainstormed a whole lot of different meanings for hot dog. From that, we learned that verbal communication is symbolic. Nonverbal communication is symbolic as well. Different, kind of hand gestures mean, sort of different things. The other day, it was Monday morning. There we go. And if we flip it around, it can mean, something completely different in some other contexts. The other day I was driving to work and it was Monday morning, and I cut a guy off on the interstate, and he was nice enough to tell me that I'm number one. I appreciated that. And more or less I said that back to him. Yes, I know I'm number one. So had I been thinking, though, I could have responded with what Lyndon just showed us, and that was you can either give them the peace sign, or it means something remarkably different in Great Britain if you flash it like that. This is an insult, that's kind of peace or V for victory, which is really funny because Winston Churchill flashed it, and I think a lot of folks thought it was V for victory, but he was really it's like it's kind of like that, it's very sort of aggressive. So it's symbolic, it's rule guided. I don't come up to you and engage in phatic communication, which we learned is greeting communication, right, in chapter 1. I don't come up to you and engage in phatic communication and give you one of those, or give you, one of those, or even from Shakespearean time, and it is still considered an insult in Europe. If you bite your tongue at or you bite your thumb at somebody like that, that's also considered an insult. So I don't do any of those things, right? I certainly don't do that. That's considered an insult, and might also even be considered a white supremacist greeting. So I don't flash that. There's lots of things that I don't do when I'm greeting someone. More likely than not, I will just kind of wave and say hello and try to smile if they can see my face. If not, they can still see that I am engaged in a genuine smile, because there's some change in these muscles right here, right around the eyes. So you have all sorts of stuff. It's symbolic, but it's also very rule guided as well. And the rules dictate which forms of nonverbal communication are appropriate in different contexts. And it can also be intentional or unintentional. The big thing about nonverbal communication is we can never turn it off. It's always on. We're always being perceived by another person. Even when those other people aren't necessarily, in the room with us, they're still perceiving our nonverbal communication. Is our verbal communication immediate? Do we get right back to them, or do we make them, wait a really long time, for a response? That's chronemics. So you're non-verbally communicating about the importance of the other person's message, even though they're not physically in the same room with you. That's why, you wait a week or whatever after you get, that attractive other person's, contact information, in a dating situation. You don't, typically immediately just text them, right back or something like that. Not usually. Again, it's rule guided. It can be intentional or unintentional. It is symbolic, and it can be intentional, unintentional. In addition to, being, symbolic, it's rule guided, right? So here we have a couple of naval officers saluting one another. I thought that it might be interesting, though, to see, how much different this image might look if I obversed it. I'm familiar with another, kind of similar picture. So it's basically the same image. I just flipped it 180. Okay. So that offends, I think, your eyes. You look at it, you're just like, what the hell are they doing? They're using the wrong arm, and immediately just kind of, jumps out at you. And you're like, hey, that doesn't look right. Why are they saluting with their left hands? I wasn't in the military, and I, don't salute folks, but I know, that you're not supposed to use that hand. That would be an example of a rule, right? Of a rule in nonverbal communication. Soldiers don't salute with their left hand. Sailors don't salute with their left hand. Okay. So it's symbolic. Here we're attempting to symbolize respect, right? Attempting to show, that I honor, your rank. Okay. So that's the symbolic exchange of esteem and respect in a formal situation when appropriate, properly executed by two naval warrant officers. And there we have the image intentionally flipped to violate your expectations, to show you that nonverbal communication is rule guided. It's symbolic and rule guided. It can be intentional, it can be unintentional. There are various different cultural meanings for that particular hand gesture. And to me, it's very interesting because maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I started exploring that OK symbol as a nonverbal emblem. I had lots of soldiers who were returning here from Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were saying that this was an insult. Very, very much, just like one of the worst nonverbal insults, that you could hurl at somebody. If you couldn't get much in, don't waste any time flipping anybody off. Shoot them this. It's like, you fly your middle finger. They kind of don't even really understand that. It's like, but you give them this. It's like they know exactly what you're calling them. So anyway, in the United States, this became accenting nonverbal communication. We have accenting nonverbal communication. That's nonverbal communication that helps us make a message, right? And that has, sort of universal, kind of cachet and meaning. And began to be abbreviated instead of OKAY. Began to be abbreviated OK in the late 1930s in Boston. And basically, it's just that, and it's meant pretty much that in the United States, since then. It's also really interesting in diving, right? because if they ask you how you are underwater, right, you don't give them that. Okay. Thumbs up means I need to surface. I've got problems. There may even be an emergency. I may be having problems, as far as, my air goes, right? This, with this, yeah, that's a diver who's got distress. You might even, get over there next to them and make sure they've got something to breathe. Okay. So you've got very, very different meanings, depending on that context, right? Which again just reinforces that it's symbolic and it's rule guided, right? This means something completely different on Facebook than it does 80 feet below the surface. Okay, completely different. In Japan, that is money. Okay, so basically, they're kind of going to rub it together and give you one of those. That's a coin. Okay. In France, this means you're worthless. It means nothing. It's a big zero, right? Now I think we do it kind of more like this, right? And it's more like, Jack Taco, and you get, that one, right? In France, it's kind of more, together like that, and that's considered zero or nothing. In Argentina, Brazil, Germany, Greece, Italy, Paraguay, Russia, Singapore, Spain, Tunisia, this sign is used as a derogatory gesture representing a bodily orifice. So they are quite literally calling you a sphincter muscle. Okay. And in the Middle East, and this is what those vets were telling me, it's really, really rude and insulting, and it is kind of evil eye. It's like I could sit here and give you the stink eye and hope that you kind of pick up on my, nonverbal, stink eye, or I can just shoot you this, and it's like, yeah, you know that if I had time, I would sit here and just stare you down, but I'm gonna give you the evil eye right here. So since then, it's taken on other meanings here in the United States, because it can look like a W. Those three letters or those three fingers, kind of outstretched like that. It's now become associated with white supremacy here in the United States. And it can be flashed in various different, kind of contexts. Again, more like that phatic communication that we were talking about, right? Which is that, kind of greeting communication, that hello, how are you doing, kind of communication. If it's flashed, in those situations, it's looked at more as like a white supremacist emblem. So, that's definitely been, a very interesting gesture that's had a lot of, I guess the best way that I could maybe describe that would be connotative volatility, maybe, right? To kind of use some of that chapter 4 language, about denotative and connotative, kind of associations. I would say that this is a symbol that has had kind of a lot of connotative, sort of volatility. It's changed. My thinking about it, has changed a lot just in the last 10 years. I originally became interested with it when I took my first dive trip in the early 90s. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting that it means, something completely different, when you're diving. And then just sort of, I wonder what it means in other countries. And then, all these vets coming back, with it, this very specific meaning, from their tours. And then, kind of recently, what it's taken on within the white supremacist, movement. So really, really fascinating gesture, and just how much this gesture's been all over the place in the last 20 years is really, really interesting. How many of you watch Billions? Billions is one of the best shows on television right now. And I have linked for you the Billions. Let's pretend we're having an argument. Fight there in the learning management system. And I very much encourage you to check that out. Look at that, watch that. I'll give you a little bit of context. I'm not going to play the clip now because it's linked for you and you have a chance to kind of check it out, on your own. But I'll give you a little bit of context. You are watching a video clip of a man who is returning to his place of business. And he has been interviewed by the feds. And the feds wanted to send him to jail. And they had a pretty good little bit of leverage over him. Turns out that he's been maintaining a completely separate household with another wife and another kid and 2 minivans and the whole deal. And they threatened to expose him. Well, he went ahead and told his first wife his big secret so that the feds wouldn't have any leverage over him anymore. And then he said, go ahead and prosecute me. It'll take you guys a long time to do that. So he returns back to his work and his boss knows what he did, but everybody else doesn't know what he did. So his boss says, let's pretend we're having an argument. And the 2 longtime close friends put on the show of a shoving match, of a fisticuffs, of a fight. And they do that to convey misinformation. They do that as an act of subterfuge to trick a competitor. Okay. But it is a tremendous example of why nonverbal communication is more believable than verbal communication. In fact, nonverbal communication is processed by a completely different part of our brain. Nonverbal communication is processed in and around the amygdala, which is a very small walnut, almond, kind of shaped size organ inside of our brain. And most of our emotions, and in particular our fight or flight reflexes, flow through the amygdala. Nonverbal communication is interpreted there, which means that nonverbal communication is pre-linguistic. If you buy the theory that we have something called a triune brain, the human brain evolved in 3 distinct different phases. First, we had this bottom part of it, kind of the brain stem, sort of area that evolved, kind of separately. That's our respiration, our basic body functions. In and around that rests the amygdala. We have our cerebellum, which includes a lot of the visual cortex. And then we have a frontal cortex, which is where a lot of language and processing like that occurs. So as we grafted on newer parts of our brain, we became better at speech and we became better at language. Prior to that, we were interpreting a lot of nonverbal communication. And that's why very much of our nonverbal communication is just to emphasize things that we are saying. And to accentuate and augment our verbal communication. What we find, though, is the reason that nonverbal communication conveys so much emotional language, and the reason that it has so much relational, type of resonance and valence, is because it's that first communication. It's what we relied on before we had language, and in particular before we had, written language. First we had spoken language, then we had written language. Before all of that, we had nonverbal communication. We had, grunts and paralanguage, and we hugged people, that mattered to us, and fought people that we didn't like. That was, much more raw, as far as emotions and as far as processing goes. Check out the Billions fight there in the learning management system. Like I said, I linked it, to some of your content. I think that you're really going to enjoy the subterfuge that they put on. It's hysterical because they do so in a glass office. So they're being watched. They're in a little fishbowl, by the entire organization. And they're having this really moving, intimate kind of, gosh, they took you in, they questioned you, are you okay? They're having a really, intimate, sort of friend conversation that matters a lot, but they're pantomiming a fight. So it's really interesting, and it causes you a lot of expectancy violation and cognitive dissonance, and you have to, the nonverbal channel, isn't jiving, with what's being said. So all of that again underscores that it's symbolic. It underscores that it's rule guided. It underscores that it's contextual. And that it's often perceived as being more believable, okay? Because that's more original. It's at a more primitive part of the brain. The evolution of those abilities literally predates language. It's multi-channeled. That's pretty self-explanatory. We talked about how there would be 5 channels. The reason that the Billions video clip works is because it's multi-channel, right? We're getting to hear what they're saying that transgresses what we're seeing. So we're in on the joke, but the other people are just being manipulated because they're only getting one of the channels, right? All they get is the visual channel, but we get the visual and the auditory channel. So we're in on the joke. We know what's happening. We understand the subterfuge. Everybody else who's watching the scene doesn't. How many of you have seen that meme? Yeah, of course. You've all seen that meme. It's gotten to be pretty ubiquitous. And anytime someone's talking about like envy or jealousy or something like that, they make that argument, right? Now, what's amazing about it is that it's just the one element, right? It's just the one, type of communication. It's the visual, sort of. Now, what you get and what makes it funny is you have all of these different meanings also imbued, into it. And you get text, you get other things, that have to do with the scene. And when those things get added to it, you can really quickly generate humor around that, just based on, the jealousy that's very clearly, conveyed. And anyway, I read a Time magazine article about this photo. It was fascinating. It's just a photographer, and he's very close with 2 of these models. And he says, he's known them, all their lives. They're like his kids. But he thought that they were just trying to convey a bunch of different emotions on the street. And this one was about jealousy. And ironically enough, this isn't even his best producing photograph. He gets almost no money from this one, but it's his most well-known photograph. Everyone knows this one. So anyway, that's kind of a little bit of backstory about all of that. It's funny because it plays on this multi kind of channeled sort of deal, but it's also interesting because it plays on this notion of nonverbal communication being continuous, right? We have this person, they're walking down the street. If it wasn't pantomimed out and wasn't shot for humorous effect, a person doing this while he's holding hands with another woman, that would be an example of some continuous nonverbal communication that would certainly cause some problems. So hopefully all of our different sort of similarities between language and non-language or nonverbal communication are articulated there. Let's talk next about the 5 primary functions of nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication essentially does 5 things. Okay, we talked about several ways that it's similar to language and how language and non-language are similar. Now let's talk about the 5 primary functions that nonverbal communication serves. Number 1 is provide information, right? Provide information. And I showed you the OK symbol. We looked at that, what it means across a number of different contexts. We did not discuss, specifically, or we didn't look at an example of a diver doing that. Okay, so here we got a diver. Obviously, diver's got airflow too. They're exhaling. You can see some bubbles. Then we have another diver, and this diver is giving us the double thumbs up. That doesn't mean that they're extra special good, right? It means that this person really needs to surface, and this person really needs to go back up, to the surface. And you also see too, there's no bubbles, coming out around that person. So I mean, they may be having some air difficulties, and they may need to really get to the surface quickly. If we're down here to a point where they're going to need to come up in stages, you may need to get over next to that person and buddy breathe. Right. So completely different context means completely different things, but it's a great context to underscore this. We're providing information, right? Sometimes you'll say, hey, pass me this, and somebody will say, I don't know which one you want, and they'll say that one and point, right? That one and point. You're providing information. You're letting the other person know specifically which one you want. It provides information in this diving context. It provides information when you use your blinker in traffic. It provides information when you use your hand signals when you're riding a bike. Okay, it provides information. It provides information on a football field when you score and you show them all your number, right? It's like, that's right, remember my number. It's like it may not provide the exact information that you think it's providing, but it does provide some information. Regulates our interactions. Okay, regulates our interactions. We know when our turn to talk is over based on what people do with their eyes, right? They'll ask you what you think, and then they'll kind of, break off eye contact and look away. That is an example of them turn taking in the conversation. We may also have somebody, goes to jump in a conversation and somebody else isn't done speaking yet, and they may, look them directly in the eye and continue talking and kind of talk over the interruption, right? That's a lot of different channels at work, right? That's regulating the interaction through the use of eye contact. It's a visual, sort of, hey, I'm still talking. And then it's also an auditory, you kind of drown the other person's voice out, by elevating your volume. And you might even say, I'm not done talking, and then finish your point. All of those are examples of using verbal and nonverbal communication to regulate interactions. We regulate interactions. Men regulate interactions sometimes without knowing it with their feet. In a conversation with a lot of people, some people will point to the most important person in the conversation with their feet. And if everyone's, kind of oriented, towards that other person, then that person, has the attention of the group. And that's more or less how the conversation is being regulated. As everybody points to what they're interested in, everybody points to what they're paying attention to. Just the opposite can happen too. You can have a conversation that's happening maybe on a back patio, and we've all been kind of outside doing our thing, and it's getting ready for the game to kick off, and a whole bunch of people want to go inside. So They all start to kind of, point their feet, inside, and you might have your back to the thing. It's not that, they don't want to pay, any attention to you, or that they are paying attention to you. They're trying to get through you and around you so they can get in there and do their thing with the game, right? So that regulates all of our interactions, with one another. I thought this was an interesting slide about regulating interactions with each other. You have this guy in the plaid shirt. He is paying attention to this person who's talking. Now, she's obviously, it looks to me like, kind of in control. Everyone's sort of huddled around her, and everybody's feet, are sort of pointed towards her. So they've all sort of gathered there to listen to what she has to say. And she's using big hand gestures and, regulating interaction with her big hand gestures. You also have maybe kind of a little side, sort of conversation that's happening over here between these two folks. And he is attempting to catch her eyes because he has something that he wants to interject into the shared meaning of the situation. In the meantime, she's kind of holding, her gaze and, sort of communicating with her. And you get the feeling that maybe the two of them are a little closer because they're engaged in a lot of extended eye contact. This person looked like she's kind of staring off, and she does not look very emotionally invested in the conversation. So nonverbal communication serves to regulate our interactions. And when we, look like we're bored with a situation, that, conveys information to the speakers. And it's impossible to turn it off because it's continuous. Nonverbal communication also allows us to express or to hide emotion, depending on how we choose to use it. We can put on a happy face, we can put on a brave face, we can be stoic about things. All of those are examples of kind of hiding feelings as opposed to, sort of having them and sitting with those feelings and emoting those feelings and expressing those feelings through nonverbal communication. So here we have a photograph of a woman expressing a lot of different emotions, and you get a sense for how complicated some of reading her emotions might be. She's communicating a lot of fairly complicated emotions in that graphic. It also, nonverbal communication also allows us to set an image, and it allows us to present and convey an image. And the dude to the left, I'm thinking, yeah, I'd let that guy operate on me. He looks pretty responsible. He's got his stethoscope and his lab equipment, and he appears to have something embroidered. Hey, at $1 a letter, up there, on the top. What the heck? Surely that guy's all right. And then you got the guy over here, to the right, same guy, little bit different uniform on, right? So I might trust him to do, something completely different, right? Not necessarily a better service, but a different service. That guy looks like him and his friend Frankie, would show up and haul off that tree, no problem, have that done quick. So I don't know.
A tree hauler?
Impression management is our attempt to influence the perceptions of others by foregrounding certain information and backgrounding other information, or controlling in general the flow of information that comes into the conversation. So that's impression management. And again, when we talk about the Johari window and how things get from closed to open, that's impression management. When we talk about the onion theory and we talk about social penetration, which we'll do when we get into friends a little bit later in the term. When we talk about the onion theory and Altman and Taylor's social penetration theory, It may be that, these are two different, sort of impressions that this guy has been presenting. And he may, Monday through Friday, make his living, with a stethoscope at a hospital. But on Saturday and Sunday, he may be a very rabid Boston College and New England Patriots fan. So you have some different impressions that are conveyed by those two different photographs. And it's essentially the same, person. I also think it's kind of funny too. We have some different nonverbal communication as far as what he's doing with his hands. This is self-comforting and closed off, right? What he's doing with his hands. You got the one hand on top of the other. It's closed off. It's also buttoned down. There's emotions, there's stuff, going on with me, but I'm not letting, very much of it out. It's highly regulated. The other one where he's got his thumbs inside his belt, that communicates power, that communicates authority, communicates comfort. It's also referred to as genitalia framing, which is really, very proactive as far as attracting attention to you on a personal level. So you've got a lot of things, from a nonverbal communication perspective, right down to what he's doing, with his hands, that all convey completely different impressions. Next is express status, power, and control. Express status, power, and control. And if you are currently seated and you are there at the desk, kind of watching, what I would like for you to do right now is take your hands and put them together like that. Put them out in front of you a little bit. It doesn't have to be, on camera. Just get comfortable with it. When you sit like that at the interview, they will know you've been coached. That is called the steeple. And it's really weird because they've done a lot of studies and they've compared folks. They compared folks who clasped their hands like that, interlocking, and folks who kind of gripped their own hands, like that. And people who put them down, on the table, and people who, put them down on the table, interlocking, and folks who sat like that, and folks who sat like this. And what they found was that all of those have different places. All of those are good at different times. But the folks who sat there with their steeple were considered the most trustworthy, the most open, the most approachable, the most transparent, the best leaders. So I don't know if that's the one that you pop into, when you're interviewing for an entry level, position. But the steeple is definitely the one that you pop into if you're interviewing for a managerial position, if you're trying to be in charge, if you're hoping to get promoted. That's all the steeple. So we express status, power, and control. We also do that with how we're dressed. That's one of the reasons why the students on campus who are in the COPS program started wearing uniforms on campus, just to kind of show them what that's like, right? You wear a uniform, everybody's looking at you. And our police science professors didn't want the first time for our students to experience that to be when they put on an Oklahoma City police officer uniform. They wanted them to experience that before they put a uniform on. So they started mandating a uniform when you're here on campus, and they've had a lot of great results in it. They feel like the students are more professionalized. They feel like the students have a better understanding of what's expected of them when they put that uniform on, and how that translates into other areas of their lives. So nonverbal communication always expresses status, power, and control. Some of you have to have the most recent phone. Is it because you really needed 0.68 more megapixels? Did you really need that much better of a camera so that you could finally shoot your documentary? I don't know. I'm asking. We convey power through all sorts of different mechanisms. We express status. Some of you, have to have that newer car. Some of you have to have, a new release. Some of you have to have, those new Air Force Ones. All those things express status, power, and control through nonverbal mechanisms, through artifacts. Steepling suggests that you have status and power, and somebody's talked to you about what to do with your damn hands during an interview. There's 9 types of nonverbal communication, and we'll conclude with these. We will not get as deeply into all of these as I had hoped to respect your time and what's coming next. There are detailed explanations of each of these in your chapter. And if you're confused about any of them, I advise you to consult chapter 5. Kinesics sounds an awful lot like a major that they have at most 4-year schools. Used to be called physical education. That used to be, what all the coaches majored in when I was a kid. But now it's called kinesiology. And it's the study of movement, the study of how people move. And I used some vector art here in this particular slide. And we just have, some different things. Had a couple I wanted to kind of talk about just really quickly. And one of them is just a very special gesture to me. Again, the universality of things so appeals to me in a world where I think our results and our relatability to different situations is so picked at. I find a lot of comfort in things that we can just all look at and say, yeah, we can all agree that's true. So when an athlete finishes a race or wins something, they typically put their hands up over their head and say, I'm strong, just like that, right there, I'm strong. What they discovered was that athletes who had no basis of social comparison, in other words, Special Olympics athletes who have been blind their entire life, they do the exact same thing when they win. They put their hands over their head. They never saw another human do it, so they didn't see that, on television. It's just euphoria, It's I am strong, I am proud, I am a winner, I am a champion. So you might remember that in a situation where you're trying to convey that you're really good, right? You might remember that in a situation where you're trying to convey, that you're really strong. You might remember that when you're watching that Billions clip a little bit later. Okay, pay attention to that. Anyway, there's so many good ones here in this vector art. Make sure you check that out. Haptics. Now, we typically do a little unit on handshaking, and we will do that when we get together next week. We'll talk a little bit about handshaking. The primary haptic that each of you will engage in is that handshaking. I have not done that since March of 2020. It was really kind of funny too. It was right before the Utah Jazz brought COVID to Oklahoma City, and we locked down. And it's kind of funny. It seemed like the rest of the country decided, well, it's in Oklahoma City, we might want to go ahead and shut down. So, pretty much after the NBA said, no, the game's canceled, everybody else, sort of did too. So we haven't done that handshaking thing since then. But I'll give you some advice about how to properly shake hands for one of these days here when we all kind of get back to that, because you will be judged when the pandemic is over by your handshake. Physical appearance. And I thought this was kind of a funny little, sort of graphic for some of that. Physical appearance communicates. Physical appearance and like how groomed we are or not communicates things. Communicates how seriously you took a certain event or a certain thing, kind of depending on how groomed you are or how well dressed you are. Artifacts. Artifacts are really interesting. I love it when I meet a new person and I'm invited to their office and I get a chance to kind of check out what they've got up on the shelves. And I'm not alone in that. Our new president, Scott Newman, dropped by my office here last week, and it was the first time he had been in my office. And he too kind of looked around and checked it out. It's like what do you have up on the walls? What's important to you? What are you programming yourself with? What have you read? What are you reading? All of those things. Anyway. Lots of folks really get a kick out of looking, at those artifacts. Anytime you enter into, a new person's home, you're looking at those artifacts, and families can tell stories, with their artifacts. Some of them have, conversation pieces that are, prominently displayed in an effort, to start a conversation about something. This has been in the family a long time, and here's, where it goes back to, and they'll tell you a little story about it. A little knickknack. Artifacts are really important, and we relate to the world based on what we have in our hands. So when we're photographed and when we're communicating with others, our relationships with others are communicated oftentimes by what we have in our hands. And that is, kind of the action, of the photograph. So always be aware of that. What do you have in your hands, when you're being photographed? It may or may not surprise you to learn, fun little fact. Folks that are photographed with an alcoholic beverage in their hand are immediately esteemed as 10% less intelligent than folks who are not. Suitors who have profile pictures of them holding guitars are communicated with significantly more often than those who do not. We relate to the world based on what we put in our hands. This is a graphic I made, several years ago about proxemics. Proxemics is just how close or far away we are from something else. And, you have Steven Seagal movies, and Steven Seagal is real big on Aikido. And Aikido teaches that this is 1.5 feet, the length, of your arm. And if something comes, into that 1.5 feet that you don't want there, then you grab them, you twist them, and you run them through a wall. Intimate, 0 to 1.5 feet. You know how far that is. It's essentially the span of your hand. It's also kind of interesting, if you was to, get in a vehicle that didn't have a bench front seat, you'd be about 1.5 feet to 4 feet next to your passenger. So you wouldn't be right up on them like you would be in that bench seat. That would be 0 to 1.5 feet, but you'd probably be about 18 inches away, from that other person. That's casual. So folks that you're casual with would be people that, you would invite into your car that you don't have a problem, giving a ride someplace, right? And then you got other folks who are social. Have you ever been at the cookout and you leaned in and shook somebody's hand? You kind of did that intimate thing, and then maybe you take another step back, from that. You take a step into that handshake, and then you take a step back from that handshake, and that would get you from intimate to casual. So you're done, having the handshake. Nice to meet you. Then you, kind of retreat back a little bit. That gets you back into that casual, kind of orientation. Social, 4 to 12 feet. That's where a lot of party, stuff happens. That's where a lot of stuff at the workplace happens, is in that social distance. We've all been told to socially distance because of the pandemic. That's 6 feet. And that falls right into what sociologists have been saying is a social distance for over 50 years. Ever since Edward T. Hall wrote The Hidden Dimension in 1966, which is all about this proxemics. And then finally, public. And that's where most like public speaking, most public interactions, campaign rallies, football games, stuff like that. That happens at that 12 to 28 feet. All right. Really quickly, chronemics is just time. How do you communicate, with time? Do other people wait on you, or do other people say, no, I don't have to wait on you, and start without you? Do people make you wait when they communicate with you, or do they get right back to you? All those are examples of chronemics and how time communicates. We also have different orientations towards how we think about time, but we'll get into that when we talk a little bit more about intercultural communication and the difference between monochromatic and polychromatic societies. Next, you have paralanguage, and we'll just kind of look at this example. It's the same sentence, I like him very much, but it means different things by stressing different words in the sentence. I like him very much. I like him very much. I like him very much. Okay, so it means three completely different things depending on which one of those words you put the emphasis on, right? The I like him very much. It could mean that you like him, but not that other person. It could also mean that you like him, but he doesn't like you. I like him very much, meaning I like that particular person, not someone else. I like him very much, and that communicates that you have strong feelings about him. So you have all sorts of different meanings depending on the paralanguage in the sentence. And if you've ever slept on the couch, it wasn't what you said, it was how you said it. Yeah. So that's paralanguage. Okay. Next is silence. We say a lot when we say nothing. Some people can offend us to such an extent that we decide that we're not going to have any communication with them now, or maybe for a little while. We may or may not, announce that to everybody. I took a little break from social media here, I don't know, about a year ago for, I don't know, it was a pretty good long time. It started off, I was just going to be a month. Wound up being, a little closer to 4. It was really good for me. Really, really needed it. Silence. We can go kind of radio silent with others. May mean that we're not investing in them. It may also mean that we're not capable of investing in them. It can also mean that you will no longer participate in a regime that you feel is unworthy of your participation. So we can communicate a lot with silence. Silence can be dehumanizing for the object of the silence. And you get some of that sometimes after interventions. If you don't stop doing this, then I'm not going to communicate with you. And I mean to, hold the line. And if you continue to keep doing this, then I guess we're just not going to be friends anymore. That's an example of silence and peer pressure being leveraged in a non-abusive way, but there's still, psychological manipulation techniques, but they're just being leveraged for a pro-social goal as opposed to a goal that only benefits you. And then finally, we have environmental factors. And environmental factors just include things like the lighting, the ambiance. One of the reasons I chose to come to you from in here today is just because of the lighting. I like the lighting in this studio. I like how it feels. I like the clean, sort of nature of it. I love the fact that there's not a classroom that's, going on next door, that we've got all these little sound dampening panels, in here. And to me, it just feels like a place where I'm, more free to teach and, kind of be myself and not worried about being interrupted, not worried about, my landline, ringing, and, institutional, effectiveness needs that report or, whatever else. It's almost kind of like being in the shower. They say, well, gosh, I would get him for you on the phone, but he's in the shower. Sorry. It's like, oh, we just can't get him, so, I feel comfortable down here. I feel like there's, good environmental factors for me as far as Zooming, down here goes. I like the lighting. I like the mood. I like the ambiance. I thought I would conclude there with a slide of a Kanye West show. I thought that was kind of funny, from a lighting, sort of perspective. And, of course, folks are lighting up their phones, and contributing, to that dynamic. When I was a kid, they would, light lighters. They don't do that so much anymore. Everybody turns their phones on. And then, of course, he's got the big light bar, there. So lots of environmental factors associated in places of worship. They do, all kinds of stuff at churches. They do all sorts of lighting stuff at shows, at theaters, theatrical, productions. There was also an interesting little example. I don't know if you're familiar with like Austin Powers, but he had the big remote control box for his bedroom. He'd make the bed spin and, do all kinds of crazy stuff with the lights. Those are all environmental factors. What time of day is the message, being sent? That's also, an environmental factor. If I'm going to be speaking in a room and it's right after lunch, chances are good I got to be extra special engaging because everybody's blood supply is going to be used in digestion, which means they're going to have less blood supply to attend to, what I'm talking about. That's an environmental factor. So all of those things are things that you got to take into consideration, when it comes to nonverbal communication and planning your message and how your message is going to be received and how other people will react to it. So that's my short take on nonverbal communication. When we're done with kind of integrating through all of those things through this next week, when we get back together again next week, we will talk about Ekman and we'll talk about those universal nonverbal micro expressions. And we'll spend a pretty good little bit of time looking at micro expressions. If you're going into counseling, if you're thinking about being an EMT, firefighter, police, any of those different professions, I think a robust knowledge of nonverbal communication is not only important, might actually save your life. I really, really encourage you to get into nonverbal communication. The other thing that we're going to do when we get together next Thursday is we will look at a series of photographs that I have put together for you that are all taken or inspired by that book that I told you about, which is What Everybody is Saying. And What Everybody is Saying is a wonderful text that was put together by Joe Navarro. And Joe Navarro was an FBI interrogator and a special agent who consulted on interrogations for over 25 years. He is a very sought after speaker for Fortune 500 companies. He is also a university professor at St. Andrews in San Antonio. And he has written this wonderful book that talks about that triune brain. And it talks about, your amygdala. And it talks about what some of these different gestures mean. So while I did tell you that there's no such thing as a denotative dictionary for nonverbal communication, I would say Joe Navarro's What Everybody is Saying might be the closest thing that we have. So I will be talking about that book and sharing some slides that are inspired by that book. And we can all kind of work through some of the different poses that are included there in What Everybody is Saying. And maybe give you, some more insight into some of these different behaviors that we engage in. Obviously, this is one that we see a lot, and that can mean a couple of different things. It can convey confidence, if your chest is, really, poked out like that. It can also convey, that you're very uncomfortable with the situation. It can convey, that you're being deceptive. It can convey that, you have information that you should share, but you're not. Or it could just mean that you're cold, right? So those are things that we will get into when we get together on Thursday. So I'm sorry, when we get together again next week on Tuesday. What we covered this week was just kind of nonverbal communication from a theoretical perspective. We will look at a much more applied perspective and look at some actual examples of people who are engaged in nonverbal communication. And we'll look and see if we can figure out what emotions they're feeling. And we'll look and see if we can figure out what exactly that pose is supposed to be communicating, whether it is or not. So I look very much forward to talking to all of you. And I believe we're going to be together in person next Tuesday. So we'll see everybody in the LRC and be safe. If you've got any questions, by all means, please get in touch. Thank you. Appreciate y'all.